committee again. I must admit, however, that I rewrote my opening statement for today's hearing based on the tragic events in Texas. But I want to begin by recognizing the more than 36,000 employees of the FBI who protect our country from violent criminals, terrorists, and others who would mean us great harm. I want to thank everyone at the FBI for their dedication and service to the country. The FBI remains on standby to jump into action to assist their state, local, and tribal partners with investigating criminal activity. And the most recent example of this was assisting in the horrific aftermath of the shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas yesterday, a shooting that has so far claimed 21 lives, 19 of them children. I, as a mother and grandmother, I can't begin to imagine the pain that these families are going through. I want to thank the FBI for sending agents in and other key staff so quickly to what I know has been a very difficult crime scene. I understand that the FBI has also made victim specialists available as part of the response, and I hope they're able to remain in this community as long as they're needed. And if this committee can provide resources to help make that happen, please let us know. I know that we don't know yet what motivated this killer. I do know that several of our colleagues have already called for better mental health screening, for enforcing laws that keep guns out of the hands of felons, and for hardening schools. I would agree with all of those recommendations. But I also think Congress needs to act to strengthen background checks and to stop allowing the sale of weapons of war. As my colleague Senator Murphy rightly pointed out yesterday, mental illness is not unique to the United States, but the devastating rate of gun violence is. We can't accept this status quo. The lives of Americans, of our children, depend on Congress being willing to enact meaningful policies to address the scope of this crisis and to keep people safe. Weapons of war enable mass shootings like the one at Robb Elementary, where we don't know the motive, and others like the shooting at Tops Market, where we know the motive all too well. People who are simply going about their everyday lives, whether it's attending religious services in Pittsburgh and Charleston, shopping at Walmart in El Paso, dancing at a nightclub in Orlando, or getting groceries in Buffalo. They were all murdered by individuals motivated by hate. The FBI's budget request of $10.8 billion includes additional resources for combating domestic terrorism and mass violence. We've discussed this topic before here in this committee, yet again and again we've witnessed white supremacists targeting others based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, or faith. Now, we're fortunate that technological progress has given us advances in medicine, science, and manufacturing, as well as improving the ease of how we can communicate with others. But unfortunately, new technologies have also allowed the rapid spread of hate, conspiracy theories, and disinformation to a wider audience, and they've allowed those with extremist views to find a community. I hesitate to call it a community because I think of community as something positive, to find others who share those extremist views. While we should be able to freely express our ideas, it should not come at the expense of someone else's life or well-being. We clearly need to find better solutions and actions to stem future violence, and I know that the FBI will be part of those solutions. Just as the FBI rapidly responds to crisis situations, I believe Congress needs to also find a way to more quickly and appropriately respond to the issue of mass violence, including those committed with firearms and domestic terrorism. I'm certainly ready to work on common sense legislation that I think the majority of Americans can support, and I'm sure that there are many of my colleagues on this committee who will join me as well. So, Director Wray, I look forward to your testimony and to the discussion today. With that, I'd like to recognize the CJS Subcommittee Vice Chair, Senator Moran, for his opening remarks.
Chairman Shaheen, thank you very much. Thank you for convening this hearing. Director Wray, welcome back to this subcommittee. I, too, before considering the budget request, like to make a brief word on yesterday's senseless act of violence that stole the lives of 19 children and 2 teachers. My wife and I have had this conversation. It's heartbreaking. The murder of these innocent children is horrific. In a small town, tight-knit community like Uvalde, that's the size of a town I grew up in, I know there will not be a single member of the community who's not touched by this tragedy. Director Wray, I'm confident that you will bring the full investigative powers of the FBI to bear in determining the motives, the warnings, and how and why. I'm also confident there will be an introspection, examining whether all laws, NICS section policies were properly followed, and we await your findings. The FBI is requesting $10.7 billion for salaries and expenses in 2023. That amount is $605 million, or 6% above the FY22 enacted. But as we've seen demonstrated in Texas and in Buffalo and nearly every city across the country, violent crime, including murders, assaults, and robberies, is on the rise. I could give this committee statistics, percentages on the rise of crime, but no one here, especially after yesterday's tragic shooting, doubts that violent crime is a growing problem in our country. We've also seen a dramatic increase in violent attacks on law enforcement officers. This is a matter that I know you, Director Wray, care about deeply. I've seen it in your conversations. I've heard it in your testimony. I experienced it on our telephone call yesterday. And I appreciate your efforts, your care and concern, and your efforts to raise awareness about the violent crime occurring across our country. While I know the Bureau is working to keep us safe here at home, we also face ever-evolving threats from foreign adversaries as well. I recognize your job is really endless. There is never enough that can be done. You've repeatedly warned that nothing presents a broader, more severe threat to our ideas, our innovation, and our economic security than the Chinese government. I understand that as of January of this year, the FBI is investigating more than 2,000 cases of Chinese government trying to steal our information and technology, and the FBI is opening a new counterintelligence case every 12 hours. I'm interested to learn about the FBI's efforts to address cybercrime and ransomware. The Bureau made transformational changes after 9/11, and these changes help keep our nation safe from acts of terrorism. Today, changes of a similar magnitude may be needed to combat cyber threats, including threats from both criminal organizations and state actors. I appreciated your comments to the students at the University of Kansas when we were there together this past March, where you emphasized how important it will be for them to bring their talents to the front line of the cybersecurity workforce. Director Wray, I look forward to hearing today about the Bureau's budget, your budget request, and I hope to be able to help you and the FBI address all of the challenges that we face in this country related to law enforcement. The challenges are tremendous. The ones that we saw reminded of again yesterday are at the forefront, but the world is a dangerous place every place we turn. I welcome you to the subcommittee, and I look forward to a somber and sober discussion of the circumstances we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Senator Moran. At this time, the chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, Senator Leahy, would like to make a statement.
Thank you, Chair Shaheen and Vice Chair Moran, for your comments. Director Wray, we've known each other for a number of years, and I'll just tell you some of my concerns. 21 victims. There's 21 families that wake up in the morning with broken hearts. Those of us who have had, whether we've had children or not, but those who've had children and grandchildren, we think 19 children murdered. Well, it says that gun violence is it's an epidemic. It can't be ignored. It can't be overstated. It can't be hidden behind the guise of an unassailable Second Amendment argument. And I don't want to politicize or overreact. I'm angry. I'm extremely angry that 19 more children and 2 adults who were fighting to protect them have been murdered. I'm angry that today too many in Congress are just willing to accept these mass shootings as another breaking news story, part of our daily lives. Oh, we'll pray for the victims. Of course we pray for the victims. But what the hell are we doing to stop further victims? I've owned firearms responsibly my entire life. I support a strong Second Amendment. I spent 8 years in law enforcement. But simple common sense and what should be our shared humanity compel us to not simply quietly acknowledge the crises. We all know there's a crisis, but then do something about it. Nearly 10 years ago, a murderer took the lives of 26 people, including 20 children at Sandy Hook. I led the Senate Judiciary Committee's action to advance legislation to help address the epidemic of gun violence. And 2 years ago, as Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I worked to break through the years-long refusal to provide the CDC and the NIH with resources to simply study the roots of gun violence. The gun lobby had blocked for years even having a study of gun violence. But now we need more. And we got to stop saying, well, next week, next month, not next year. We have to do it now. How many more people will die before this country says enough is enough? I'll say today, it's enough. So, Director Wray, thank you for being here today. As the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you have a critically important job. You have to protect our country from threats of terrorism and crimes, both foreign and domestic. And doing that, while you're doing it, you have to uphold the rights and values that make this a great democracy. I don't envy that task, and I respect that task. But the heinous mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, earlier this month is a stark reminder that domestic terrorism is still very much present in the United States. It's also a somber reminder that the majority of domestic terrorism perpetrated against innocent Americans is driven by those espousing white supremacist and racist ideologies. Now, that's not a controversial statement, it's a simple fact. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. When facts are distorted into untruths and parroted by those with a pulpit to do so, we tread dangerously far from the core tenets of our democracy. We can clearly and unequivocally condemn the actions of white supremacists or simply acknowledge the January 6, 2021 attack on our Capitol for what it was, an insurrection. We fan the flames of hatred and violence, and we allow them to grow. It's alarming to me. It should be to every American. It is in my state of Vermont, whether you're Republicans or Democrats, independents, it's alarming. But it also further highlights the importance of the work of the dedicated men and women of the Bureau and your leadership there, Director Wray. Each year, this Appropriations Committee will wrestle with how best to dedicate valuable taxpayer dollars. Next week, I'm going to have binders about this thick. My home in Vermont, where it's nice and quiet, reading through all these budget requests. But in exchange, of course, for the money we send, we expect the FBI to confront forcefully, head-on, the threats of domestic terrorism. We expect you to faithfully and fully adhere to the rule of law, to investigate whatever crime is committed, to work with the Department of Justice and state and local law enforcement, to hold the perpetrators of any crime accountable. I stand ready to support you, but I also want you to respond when we have questions from either Republicans or Democrats on this committee. So I could say a lot more. I won't. I'd rather hear the Director, Chair Shaheen, but thank you for the courtesy.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Director Wray, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Shaheen, Ranking Member Moran, Chair Leahy, members of the subcommittee,
I know, of course, that we're here to talk about the FBI's budget, but like all of you, I want to begin with what's on everybody's hearts and minds. Yesterday, we got the news that we all dread, including those of us in law enforcement. We do this work for the victims, both the actual victims and the victims we're trying to prevent from being victims. And there's no category of victims that more motivates the men and women of law enforcement, including the men and women of the FBI, than children. And parents got calls yesterday that are too devastating to even fathom, and a community, really a whole nation, was shaken by another horrific mass shooting, this time, once again, at an elementary school full of young kids just days away from finishing their school year. And my heart goes out to the families of the victims and to the entire community of Uvalde. I know that you're experiencing unimaginable pain and trauma, and the entire FBI family feels your heartbreak and stands with you. There will certainly be more that we're going to learn about this heinous attack in the days ahead, and I know the American people, and especially the people of Uvalde, are looking for answers. I do want to acknowledge the heroism of all law enforcement who responded immediately to the scene. For our part, the FBI will continue to work around the clock with the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Uvalde Police Department and our other state, local, and federal partners to assist in any way we can. We are dedicating the full resources of the FBI's San Antonio field office and a whole host of other FBI divisions to helping the Texas DPS and the Uvalde Police, who have the lead in the investigation. On top of that, we're devoting significant national resources, including investigative and analytical resources, evidence response and laboratory personnel, victim services professionals to assist the families of the victims, crisis management and behavioral analysis units. So bottom line, we are absolutely heartbroken about yesterday's tragic events and committed to doing our part to support our partners in the investigation and the community of Uvalde as we begin to try to move forward. Of course, the range of criminal, cyber, and counterintelligence threats we face as a nation has never been greater or more diverse, and the demands and expectations placed on the FBI have never been higher. And before I take your questions, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the FBI's efforts in some of those areas, namely our efforts to combat terrorism, both domestic and international, and our efforts to help tackle the rise in violent crime. Unfortunately, this tragedy, as well as the recent tragedy in Buffalo and way too many before, reinforce what we in the FBI have been so concerned about for so long, and that is the threat of lone actors who look to attack regular, everyday people going about their regular, everyday lives. And in fact, it's that threat that we continue to be most concerned about here in the homeland. And while it is too soon to be commenting on the motivation behind yesterday's tragedy, and I don't want to get out ahead of Texas DPS, which has the lead on that, as the horrific attack a little over a week ago in Buffalo shows, we've got to continue to stay laser-focused on our efforts to counter violence motivated by hate and extremism. Even on the international terrorism side, we are seeing homegrown violent extremists inspired by groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, acting alone or in small groups and leaving fewer dots to connect and less time in which to connect them. And countering fast-moving threats like these requires a team approach, so we've requested an enhancement not just for additional investigators, but also support personnel to help us perform the important outreach and partnership building that is so essential to countering this threat. The scourge of violent crime, of course, extends beyond mass shootings and beyond crimes motivated by extremist ideology. In fact, rising violence is the #1 concern I hear about from chiefs and sheriffs all across the country with whom I speak just about every week. With those partners, we're leading hundreds of task forces to get the worst of the worst off the streets We're sharing intelligence to focus our collective efforts, and we're providing technical resources and expertise to bring more violent criminals to justice. Last fiscal year, those task forces focused on violent crime made more than 17,000 arrests, seized more than 8,000 illegally possessed firearms, and dismantled nearly 300 gangs and criminal enterprises across the country. And that's all separate and apart, and in addition to all of our joint terrorism task force work on the counterterrorism side, domestic terrorism, international terrorism. I should add that with this hearing falling 2 years to the day after the murder of George Floyd, I do want to emphasize that we and our state and local partners are also focused on improving interactions between law enforcement and the communities we all serve to ensure equal justice for all. Of course, these are just a few of the threats we're tackling. The FBI's budget request this year reflects the breadth, depth, and complexity of those threats. In addition to the things I've already mentioned, each and every day our folks are also dealing with an ever-expanding array of threats on the cyber front, from ransomware and the theft of trade secrets and personal information, to malign influence campaigns, to intrusions targeting our critical infrastructure. And that includes working with our private sector, government, and foreign partners to meet the danger from Russian cyber actors during this time of Russia's unprovoked aggression in the Ukraine. We're also taking on the Chinese government's broad-scale economic espionage campaign that targets our innovation, our ideas, our economic security. And today, as we mark the 40th National Missing Children's Day, it's important to highlight the work of our 400 FBI personnel and nearly 800 additional officers who serve on our child exploitation and human trafficking task forces that we have dedicated to investigating crimes against children and to identifying and locating child victims. Our fellow citizens look to us to protect the United States from all those threats and a whole bunch more, and I'm proud to see the men and women of the FBI step up and rise to meet those challenges every day. I'd like to again thank this subcommittee for all the support you've provided the men and women of the FBI over the years, and to the community of Uvalde. We will provide whatever resources we can. We will support you however we can, and we will stand with you in our thoughts and our prayers. And thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Director. Let me just announce at the beginning that we will have 5-minute questioning rounds. I will call on people in order of arrival, and all of the questioners will be in person. We will not have anyone on WebEx. I will begin the questions, and I know it's very recent, but are there any updates that you can give us from Uvalde for what we have found out about the shooter's motivation, I know the reports have been that he acted alone, as you pointed out, but is there any other information that you can share with this committee?
There's really, unfortunately, it's such a fluid situation right now, and I do really want to respect the fact that the Texas DPS has the lead on the investigation, so I don't want to get out in front of them right now. My experience teaches me that in these incidents, the facts change, as we understand them, often quite rapidly in the first few days. So, with respect, there's not much I can add right now beyond what's already been reported in the press.
You said in your testimony that one of the biggest threats is, and concerns, is the threat of lone actors who attack people they don't know indiscriminately. Are there statistics over the years that show that there's been an increasing percentage of those kinds of crimes? And do we have any idea, any research into what is motivating those kinds of lone individuals?
So on the first part, on the statistical side, I don't know that I could quote you statistics right here, but I can definitely tell you that we at the FBI, and I know from my first few months as FBI Director, have been highlighting this threat, the lone actors, or effectively lone actors, using readily accessible weapons, attacking what is often referred to as soft targets, which are essentially, as I said in my opening, regular everyday people wherever they're doing their lives. As to what motivates them, that's all over the map. I mean, it's everything from the racially motivated violent extremists to different sorts of anarchists and militia violent extremists to homegrown violent extremists, which is a term we use to sort of distinguish people who are here already in the U.S., but who are inspired by foreign terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. And then increasingly, we're seeing people with this kind of weird hodgepodge blend of ideologies. The old school world of kind of people with some purity of radical ideology then turning to violence is often giving way to people who have kind of a jumble of mixed up ideas. And, you know, we've seen cases where somebody 1 month is saying they're an ISIS supporter, and then the next month they say they're a white supremacist. We had a case in Minneapolis where a bunch of guys that described themselves as Boogaloo Boys then ended up deciding to provide material support to Hamas. I look at the El Paso shooter in the Walmart there. If you look at his so-called manifesto, it's all over the place. So we're having more and more challenges trying to unpack what are often sort of incoherent belief systems combined with kind of personal grievances.
Well, and there's no doubt, as you pointed out, that violent crime is increasing. I see that in my home state of New Hampshire. And it seems like over the last couple of years, it's been a reaction to COVID, to the opioid epidemic, to factors, obviously, the availability of weapons is another factor. Are there other things that we're thinking have happened over the last couple of years that have really contributed to the violent crime that we're seeing today?
Well, I would agree with the first, the several that you listed. I would add to that that we are seeing, for a variety of reasons, in some places, way too many of repeat offenders or dangerous offenders ending up back out on the street, certain prosecution practices or sentences that don't adequately keep somebody behind bars when they really need to be. And I would say that a lot of police departments in this country, if you talk to most chiefs and sheriffs, which, as I said, I'm doing just about every week, most of them are really struggling with recruiting and retention, and that certainly doesn't help. So we need to support the men and women of law enforcement because that's who stands between us and the violent criminal element.
Thank you. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Director Wray, this subcommittee has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Stop School Violence Act since its enactment in 2018. As you would know, these programs support school resource officers, hardening of our schools, anonymous reporting hotlines, threat assessment programs, and training for school personnel. Your team at the FBI has some of the best minds in the world when it comes to emergency situations. Have you heard from your experts? What have you heard from your experts about the most effective ways to prevent and respond to these terrible events?
So I think what I would say is we're doing a number of things on this front to try to help harden, if you will. And I hate the fact that we even have to talk about hardening our schools, but it is a reality that that they have become targets. So we, in addition to all of our investigative work, our bread and butter, you know, the cases we're bringing of different sorts, violent crime, terrorism crime, gang crime, et cetera, we provide all sorts of support through training and capacity building. So we have trained, I think, something like 110,000 different law enforcement officers on active shooter response. We have put out a whole bunch of different PSAs and instructional videos to schools, to school resource officers, to school administrators, to houses of worship, to communities, as well as to law enforcement, to help them better defend. And there's a host of information in there. In addition to that, we're obviously providing forensic support through our lab. We're doing shooting incident reconstruction. I mentioned in my opening statement, in Uvalde, we have evidence response. That's often one of the things that we are quickly asked to provide by our state and local partners. But that's, of course, after the fact, and what we're trying to do is figure out how to better get in front of it.
We'd welcome your advice and suggestions. Last year in this room, you and I spoke at least briefly about counterintelligence threats along the southern border. 2 weeks earlier, I'd had the opportunity to question the Attorney General about the cartel's activities there. The purpose of those questions a year ago were to address what I'd learned on my visits to McAllen, Texas, that last year, that just previous to those hearings, which is while immigration dominates the conversation about the southern border, there are also grave national security threats there. This was confirmed just yesterday when an FBI search warrant unsealed in Ohio revealed that an assassination plot against former President George W. Bush included plans to smuggle assassins into the United States from Mexico. According to press reports, the suspect, an ISIS operative, was recorded claiming to have just smuggled 2 individuals associated with Hezbollah into the United States. Yesterday's events compel me to start again on this topic that we discussed last year. What's the FBI's assessment of our national security threats along our border, southern border in particular, but borders generally? And what can you tell us in this setting about the number of known or suspected terrorists or special interest aliens who have crossed into the United States from Mexico?
Well, certainly border security is a major challenge that cuts across a whole host of the programs that we serve. And the national security piece of it that you're highlighting is one part of it. Obviously, I'm very proud of the work that our folks did on the Ohio case that you mentioned. We obviously work closely with Secret Service on that to coordinate that, to make sure that it was all done in a way that prevented any true threat from coming to fruition. Certainly, any porous point of entry is a potential vulnerability that bad actors of all sorts, including national security threats, can seek to exploit. And I've been down to all of our field offices that have border crossings as part of their area of responsibility. I've had CBP folks show me around so I can see firsthand what they're dealing with, and they have a heck of a challenge on their hands. And we, through our joint terrorism task forces in particular, work very closely with our DHS partners to try to bring the counterterrorism dimension to the threat. I think that's probably all I would be able to say about it in an open hearing, but certainly you're right to be focused on it as an issue of concern.
Perhaps we'll have the chance to have a closed session as well. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Director, I remember when you were nominated and confirmed. Boy, was I glad to see you. I believe then and I believe now that you're not a politician. I think your predecessor was. And he and others did immeasurable damage to one of the most important institutions in American government. Because I believe, as you do, that in addition to the DEA, the FBI is probably the premier law enforcement agency in all of human history, and it should be above politics. For the record, who is Michael Sussman?
Well, Michael Sussman is a lawyer who is currently involved in a trial by the Durham Special Counsel team.
His law firm, Perkins Coie, was counsel to Secretary Hillary Clinton's campaign, right?
Senator, I'm mindful, as I think you would expect me to be, that the case is currently in the middle of
No.
trial, and well, we have agents, and I have assigned agents to work on the Durham team. I want to be really, really careful about not getting into a discussion about a case that's currently in front of a very independent and strong-willed federal judge and a jury right now. So,
Well, Mr. Sussman was counsel to Secretary Clinton's campaign, and we also know that he was the source of the information provided to the FBI that the Trump campaign had a back-channel communication to Russia, which we now know isn't true. Is it true that Michael Sussman, a partner at Perkins Coie, counsel to the Hillary Clinton campaign, and the source of this information about the allegations regarding the Trump campaign, is it true that he had a badge that gave, an FBI headquarters badge that gave him special privileges in entering the FBI building?
well, Senator, what I would say to you is much in keeping with the gracious comments you made at the beginning about my commitment to trying to make sure I do this job the right way. That includes making sure that with a case that is currently in the middle of trial and an investigation being run by Mr. Durham that we are actively helping him with. I don't think I can really get into a discussion of those topics at the moment.
When the FBI opened a file to investigate Mr. Sussman's allegations, is it true that the FBI concealed Mr. Sussman's identity?
Again, I completely understand your interest in the question, and I respect it, and I just hope you will respect the fact that because I've got agents working with Mr. Durham on the case and they're in the middle of trial right now, I just don't think I can get into a discussion of that here.
When the FBI opened its file to investigate the allegations that Mr. Sussman, on behalf of the Clinton campaign, made, now known to be untrue, about these back-channel communications between the Trump campaign and Russia. When the FBI opened the file, is it true that the file said the source of this information was not Mr. Sussman, but the Department of Justice?
Again, the same response. These are the very kinds of questions that are being litigated in front of the jury and Judge Cooper right now.
Senator Kennedy, I would just urge you to follow a separate line of questioning. As Director Wray has said, he's not going to answer questions relative to this case that's being litigated.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair, and you know how much I respect you. I want my time back, by the way.
You can have those 3 seconds that I
No,
took.
you talked for about 10 seconds.
I'm happy to give you those 10 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your help with my questions, but I can handle it myself. Chris, at some point, you're going to have to address this. And I understand you don't want to address it in the middle of a prosecution. But there are millions of Americans that look at this and think, I'm not saying they're correct, that the FBI has become a political organization. And at some point, you're going to have to address that. The institution is just too important. And some of my colleagues may not want to talk about this, but we're going to have to talk about it at some point.
Well, so first off, I totally appreciate your concern about our institution, and I will tell you that what I can speak to now is that I have implemented all sorts of reforms that I've spoken about quite publicly, over 40-plus corrective measures that deal with a lot of the same issues that are at the heart of the underlying investigation. I completely turned over the entire leadership team in the FBI. We've taken disciplinary action where we could, but we've also been in close cooperation and coordination with Mr. Durham, who is the special counsel, and I think that's the best thing I can do to help address the concerns you're talking about. As to the FBI's reputation, I will tell you, having been to all 56 of our field offices, now almost all of them twice, having been to New Orleans just earlier this month and Baton Rouge just shortly before that, what I find in talking to Americans out in the field, law enforcement partners, business leaders, community leaders, victims, prosecutors, families, is a widespread, even resounding appreciation and respect for the men and women of the FBI. And you will be, I hope, relieved to know that in Louisiana, over the last 3 years, last two and a half years, the number of people in Louisiana applying to be special agents of the FBI has doubled what it was in the first few years when I took over. And so I think that speaks very well of the good citizens of Louisiana and their appreciation and view of the FBI's credibility.
And I thank you for coming, Chris, and I thank you for all the hard work you've done. But I'm going to stand by my comments. I think at the right time, you're going to have to address this and assure the American people that,
Senator
that
Haggerty.
the rot is gone. Thank you. Thanks for being here, Chris.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sheen. And Director Wray, it's good to see you here again. I'd like to turn my comments to something very disturbing that's happening right now with respect to the Supreme Court justices. And what we've seen in recent weeks are protests at the homes of Supreme Court justices and their families, something that I think that should be completely out of bounds. It also may be illegal. Federal law prohibits protesting at the residence of a judge with the intent of influencing the judge. And many of the protesters are doing just that, protesting outside judges' homes, attempting to intimidate them, I think, into changing their ruling on the Dobbs case. So, Director Wray, is the FBI in any way investigating these protesters as a potential crime?
So I don't want to get into any particular predicated assessment or investigation that we may have ongoing right now. I will say that we're working very closely with the U.S. Marshals, who, as you may know, are now providing round-the-clock security at the justices' homes, and with the Supreme Court Marshal and Supreme Court Police. Together, they have responsibility for protection of the judges themselves and their facilities. But I will tell you this, my view and my instructions to the FBI are that there is a right way and a wrong way in our system and under the Constitution to express what you're upset about and who you're upset with. And violence and threats of violence, no matter what you're upset about or who you're upset with, is not the way to go.
I couldn't agree with you more.
We will pursue all lawful, predicated investigations we can to ensure that.
The U.S. Supreme Court Police recently reported, I'm going to use their quote, a significant increase in violent threats to your concern against Supreme Court justices and the Supreme Court building. And as FBI Director, it sounds, and I just wanted you to confirm that you've received information that the Supreme Court and its members are facing elevated threats that do warrant increased security intelligence resources.
As I said, we're in close contact with them, receiving tips and leads and things like that from them, and without, again, weighing in on what in the way of assessments and investigations we have open. But my charge to our people is that we are going to aggressively pursue violence and threats of violence against public officials, including against judges.
I appreciate that, Director Wray, and I think I share your concerns, and I think that many on our committee. I am working here on our side to make certain that, along with the extra help that the U.S. Marshals are providing right now, that if there's any shortfall in monetary resources needed, particularly in the very near term, to make certain that the justices and their families are properly protected, that we address that, because heaven forbid these threats turn into or manifest themselves into the violence that I think concerns us both. I'd like to turn to another issue now that's at our southern border, specifically the case of a Colombian national named Isnardo Garcia Amado, who recently crossed our southern border and who was flagged by the FBI Terrorist Screening Center. He was released by Border Patrol agents into the United States on April the 18th. Then on April the 21st, 3 days after his release, the FBI alerted the Department of Homeland Security that this man was on the terrorist watch list. You'd think that DHS would have then immediately arrested this person, yet despite knowing that a suspected terrorist had been released in the United States, the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security didn't even authorize ICE to arrest him until 2 weeks later. He was in Florida by that time. So this Colombian national was caught by DHS and then released into the United States before the FBI determined that he's on the terrorist watch list. Is that your understanding as well?
I will confess, Senator, that I'm not sure I'm familiar with the specific case. It has a vague ring of familiarity from something I got briefed on, but I think I would have to circle back to you, which I'm happy to do.
I'd appreciate that. You can see my concern, though, and I guess my broader question is, in your view, if this were to happen, does that jeopardize American safety to catch and release border crossers before the FBI has had the opportunity to make that determination as to whether or not they're terrorists?
Well, certainly, I think we need to have close lash-up between FBI agents on the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, especially in the border states, with their DHS counterparts, who have a very tough job, those folks, those CBP folks down on the line there that I've met with. And they usually have people designated on our task forces, which is designed in part to prevent some of the slippage.
No, that slippage is a great concern. Even further concerning is DHS taking 2 weeks after receiving information from the FBI to actually notify us to arrest a person. I mean, does that concern you as well as slippage that could, again, endanger American safety?
Well, I certainly understand the concern. I think I would need to kind of drill in further on the facts to make sure I've got the full context.
I would appreciate that. And also, when you come back to me, if you could let me know how many border crossers have been apprehended that are on the national terrorist list. I'm deeply concerned about this. When I went to the border myself about 6 weeks ago, I was informed that 157 different nationalities have been apprehended at our southern border in the past year. That's a deep, deep national security concern, and I would very much appreciate your following up with me in terms of what's known, and also if you have any estimates on what's not known, because I would think that's an even greater concern. Are those people that are coming here using the border, as Senator Moran talked about, for some very nefarious purposes? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Haggerty. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director, for being with us today. We are going to be asked to consider legislation, I believe, tomorrow regarding domestic terrorism, and much of your statement, written statement, was devoted to the topic of domestic terrorism. The DOJ has a unit dedicated to anti-domestic terrorism efforts presently, and you testified last year that your agency has significantly boosted resources directed towards these initiatives. Can you elaborate on the FBI's existing initiatives on domestic violence or domestic terrorism prevention and investigation, and how you're already working with existing agencies and departments? And I would say that one of the fears that I would have with this legislation before us is that we're creating more stovepipes of information that in reality could slow the flow of information and accuracy of that. So I'd like to hear your comments on that, please.
Well, I would probably decline to weigh in on the legislation itself, as is our
figured
usual
that. That's
practice.
okay.
But as to, you're right, that we are doing a whole lot on domestic terrorism already. We have, I think, over the last few years, and this really started, I would say, in summer of 2019, and kind of has just continued since then. We have, I think, more than doubled our domestic terrorism caseload. We have, I think we're now up to about 2,700 domestic terrorism investigations. They cover the waterfront of different types. We have also created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell to bring both of those kinds of expertise together. We've had some very significant plots disrupted using those efforts. We have our Joint Terrorism Task Forces in all 56 field offices.
Right.
That's about 4,400 or so investigators. They're working on it. But I will also say, in our budget request before the subcommittee, we are asking for more resources for domestic terrorism. That's separate and apart from any legislative effort, just in our FY23.
Where would you say those those extra dollars, which parts of your investigative domestic terrorism arm would you see need to be increased budgetarily, or is it just an overall?
Well, I would say it's two things. It's investigators and tools. technical tools. You know, increasingly in the domestic terrorism space, much like in other criminal arenas, the terrorists are reverting to use of technology that makes it harder and harder to connect the dots, and so that's a part of it. But the other thing is we have, in the short run, had to sort of surge resources to handle that domestic terrorism caseload. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, I do not think we're in a position where any of these other threats, the traditional violent crime threat that I hear about from chiefs and sheriffs all the time, the international terrorism threat that has absolutely not gone away.
Right.
That had slightly abated during COVID, the foreign terrorist threat, but especially in the wake of the withdrawal in Afghanistan, I think we, the FBI, are going to have a bigger and bigger role on the foreign terrorist threat. So partly our budget request is designed to make sure that the sort of duct tape approach that we've been using for the last 18 months to 2 years is not the way we have to continue going forward, so we can have a longer standing commitment to the domestic terrorism load.
So a more robust and wider reach, and
Right.
that's, and you're not taking from something else
Correct.
to put that into your. I'm curious to know, and I think the American public would like to know, I have no idea what the answer to this question is, I think I know. The tragedy in Texas, what role does the FBI play in this, or do you play a role in this?
So we're in a support role. We are, so Texas DPS, Texas State Law Enforcement Agency, which is a terrific partner of ours, and the Uvalde Police Department, they have the lead. We're in support role. Now, our support takes all sorts of forms. So we have investigative resources, analytical resources. We have lab personnel doing evidence
Right.
response. We have other kinds of forensic response. We have victim services professionals, as I mentioned to the chair, who are helping the families and of the victims. We have crisis management teams, behavioral analysis teams. So we have a whole host of things down there, and so while it's a formidable footprint and engine, it is, at the end of the day, in support of our great state and local partners.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for those agents that are working in that support. This is very difficult, I'm sure, for them as well. And I would just like to add, just very briefly, the local offices that I hear from, my Charleston, West Virginia folks, I just want to thank them and you, because they're very tied to us. I'm sure all of us have heard from our local offices in this time of sort of uneasiness. And I just really appreciate the efforts with which they go to include me, my family, and others that might be in precarious situation from time to time. So please extend my great gratitude for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Collins to ask her questions while I go vote, and either Senator Moran or I will be back shortly.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. You know how much I like having the gavel. Director Wray, thank you, first of all, for being here today. Your agency is so important in so many areas, in so many ways. All of us are clearly horrified by the vicious killings that occurred yesterday. And I want to ask you about one approach that's been taken and get your judgment about it. The state of Maine is among some states that have enacted statutes that we call either a red or yellow flag law. And the law in Maine, which was developed in consultation with a wide range of groups, essentially allows the court to have the police temporarily confiscate firearms from someone who is deemed to be a danger to either him or herself or to others. Importantly, the Maine law includes due process rights and a medical assessment. So it can't be just some neighbor's opinion or even a family member's opinion. There has to be a medical assessment as well. And that's to ensure that the concerns are well-founded and that Second Amendment rights for law-abiding citizens are protected. In your experience, how successful have these relatively new red flag and yellow flag laws been?
It's a very good question. I would say I'm not sure that I've seen any kind of rigorous assessment overall of the effectiveness of the so-called red flag laws. There are other names for it, as you alluded to. I know that DOJ has recently published a model statute for states to consider. I think what I could say to you is that it's been our experience that with a whole wide variety of shooter situations, whether it's a terrorist type situation or a more traditional violent criminal situation, most of the time you see that there was someone who knew the person or came into contact with the person who saw some change in behavior that alarmed them. And in the situations where law enforcement has been successful at preventing an attack, it's almost always thanks to somebody like that coming forward. And whether it's done through a protection order of the sort you're describing, or whether it's just because they contacted law enforcement and law enforcement was able to act, that's the key. And the ones that haven't been prevented, an awful lot of the time, it turns out there was somebody who maybe didn't know to contact law enforcement or was afraid to contact law enforcement for one reason or another. And you hear all the time the saying, if you see something, say something. And most people, when they hear that, they picture the unattended backpack, in the Greyhound bus terminal or something. But what we really need right now in this country is if you see something about somebody, people to say something. And if they do, whether it's through statutes like the one in Maine or through some other mechanism, that can be quite effective. And certainly, if more states were to adopt these laws, we would, on our end, through NICS and NCIC, have to make arrangements to be able to then have that information in the relevant databases to be able to help prevent them from getting their hands on a weapon. But certainly it's something we could look at.
Thank you. Another proposal that I've long supported would strengthen federal law by making it easier for prosecutors to go after gun traffickers and straw purchasers. And let me describe what I've seen and heard about in the state of Maine from law enforcement officers. Gangs and drug dealers target addicts who have clean records. So they then ask them to purchase guns for them, and they swap heroin or other drugs for the guns. These guns are then used to commit horrific crimes in our communities, often far from Maine. There was a gang in Connecticut that was known for coming to Maine, enlisting addicts to buy guns for them because the addicts had clean records and could pass the background check. So this Congress, I once again joined my colleague, Senator Leahy, in reintroducing the Stop Illegal Trafficking in Firearms Act. And we would create a new criminal offense for straw purchasing. Right now, it's essentially treated as a paperwork violation, a slap on the wrist. Instead, we would make these crimes punishable by time behind bars. What is your opinion of closing that straw purchaser loophole that allows for criminal gangs to access guns when they could not buy them themselves because of their own criminal records?
Well, I think I would have to study the legislation more closely to give you a more informed assessment of that. I will tell you that even back to when I was a line prosecutor, I used to prosecute a lot of these same straw purchaser cases, and typically, as you say, they're prosecuted as false statements cases, when somebody essentially lies on the 4473 form. And just as you say, what you see over and over all is violent gang members who enlist people who are down on their luck for one reason or another. Either they're, as you say, they're addicts, or they're financially in distress. And so the money that comes with it, when they get paid to be the straw purchaser, they take advantage of people who are down on their luck that way. I think there might be a difference in the culpability level for the straw purchaser versus the gang member who enlists them. And that's when I tried those cases and prosecuted those cases, that was sort of the approach we took. But I think you're right to be focused on the straw purchaser issue as an important ingredient to preventing guns from getting in the hands of people who are, after all, prohibited under existing law from having them.
Right. I actually feel bad for many of the straw purchasers because they frequently have serious substance abuse problems, and they're being manipulated and used by these gang members. But that is a real problem. Let me follow up on the drug issue. And as we know, America has set a terrible new record in the number of drug overdoses in the past year. It's 104,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. In Maine, an estimated 636 people died of drug overdoses in 2021. That's a 23% increase from the previous year. But what to me is even or equally chilling is the fact that that's actually only a small portion of the number of overdoses. The number of overdoses in Maine that we know about was nearly 9,000. Fortunately, the rest of them were saved. I talked to Attorney General Garland about this issue, and he pointed out that the FBI, along with other DOJ components, is playing an important role in fighting the large-scale drug trafficking organizations that are bringing drugs into this country. I am concerned about what is happening at the southern border based on my discussion with border control agents. Has the government's inability to secure the southern border led to more drugs entering the United States?
Well, certainly the influx of drugs across the southern border is a very important fuel, not just to addiction in this country, but to violence in this country. Right. And that's one of the parts that the FBI plays a pretty big role in. You have transnational criminal organizations in Mexico enlisting the help of gangs and other organizations here in the U.S. to distribute the drugs, and there's violence over turf, over distribution routes, et cetera. I know that when I've been down to the border and talked to the CBP folks there and to our field offices that have responsibility in that area, the quantity of the seizures that they routinely are engaged in make the seizures in other parts of the country look really quite small by comparison. I mean, it's just another day in the life for a lot of them, and so it's striking. And I think you're correct that the overdose death statistic, or the overdose statistic itself, in some ways underestimates the scope of the problem, in part because Narcan, happily, has become so much more widely available, but that in turn ends up almost masking the problem. So the effectiveness of first response, which is a good thing, is actually maybe misleading some into thinking that the problem is not as bad as it really is, and it's really an epidemic.
And finally, just a quick question. You were talking about domestic terrorism with Senator Capito. Would you agree that the sources of domestic terrorism include groups and ideologies on the left, on the right, from overseas, such as ISIS. In other words, there's not just one ideological source of domestic terrorism, is there?
Certainly, when we look at domestic terrorism, we focus on the violence, and and we're sort of ideology agnostic, if you will. And the terrorism, the domestic terrorism threat we see covers the waterfront from people, we don't use terms like left and right, but we see the racially motivated violent extremists. We see militia violence and anarchist violence. We see people with this kind of a salad bar of ideologies that don't fit into any category. And then, of course, we tend to bucket it under the international terrorism side, the ISIS-inspired folks who are here. They're not sent here by ISIS, but they're here and they're radicalized online. That's a huge category, and the plot that we disrupted that was talked about earlier involving the attempt to kill former President Bush is a good example of that threat. So I think I understand the focus on ideology, but for us, the focus has to be on the violence to make sure that we're not missing something in that regard.
And that's where it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can't remember the last time we've had the chance to speak, but good to have you back again. I want to go back to, and I think I asked Mr. Garland, or somebody else this question, but when you go back to 2020, the summer of it, there was a lot of crime in our cities. And of course, what I've been hearing mostly about would be the arrests that we've made associated with January 6th. So can you give me some kind of accounting in terms of all the various incidents that occurred across our big cities that had, the crime in the streets, where I think we actually ended up with more people killed, lots of downtown businesses, burned and damaged. Have we been as diligent there as we have on the January 6th issue? And just give me a general accounting, where I know that we've arrested over 700 individuals associated with it. What have we accomplished from what was, something maybe even broader in scope in terms of damage and lives lost?
So I don't have exact numbers for you here, but what I will tell you is that the violence amidst all the civil unrest over the summer of 2020, we used all 56 of our field offices. We used our joint terrorism task forces in all 56 of our field offices. There were hundreds of investigations, hundreds of arrests. Now, I should pause on that last part because often there is, as you know, no domestic terrorism offense, federal domestic terrorism offense. So a lot of times we on our joint terrorism task forces, which have state and local officers assigned to them, part of the reason for that is that sometimes the most effective charge is a state charge. So a lot of times the federal investigations from some of the activity over the summer resulted ultimately in some state charge. But we had any number of cases involving Molotov cocktails, burning and firebombing, police cars, things like that. And we continue. They don't get a lot of attention in the press, but we continue to develop cases and bring charges still from some of the activity back then. So we have not taken our foot off the gas on those cases.
I didn't know if you'd have that information. I'd like to know with a little more specificity, and get back to the office later in terms of what that kind of comparison would be in terms of arrests and convictions based on January 6th versus the whole spectrum of what occurred back in the summer of 2020, if you would.
I'll see what we can get you on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tragically, we've had another shooting occur. I'm interested in that mental health component. I'm interested in whether it's racially motivated, whether it's just somebody that is out to create havoc like just occurred. What are we doing that takes information that in many cases is broadcast as aggressively as being in a manifesto. Maybe not that direct, but we pick up always after the fact that there's been some telegraphing of what might happen. So are we doing what you think needs to be done to kind of figure out what might occur when we find out after the fact that there's generally been information out there from as obvious as a manifesto to maybe a lot of indications that this could happen? Are you happy with what law enforcement is doing across the board, especially the FBI?
Well, I'm very proud of the hard work of the men and women of law enforcement, not just the FBI, but our state and local partners who bear the primary burden for a lot of what you're talking about. I will say that there is no shortage of hateful information out there on the internet and social media in different forms. And we, the FBI, don't just go out and kind of monitor social media sort of passively looking for stuff. We rely on proper predication and then pursue it. So what that really gets back to is the exchange that I had with Senator Collins about the importance of having the public come forward. You know, I used the saying that used to be applied in a different context: if you see something, say something. What we need, what law enforcement needs, is the public, neighbors, school teachers, relatives, friends, classmates, whoever, the people who are likely to see somebody's behavior online and see it change from just being somebody just blowing off steam to taking a bit of a turn. And that's often the same person who would know this person's not only just taken a really dark turn, but this person I know, you know, this member of the public, has weapons in his or her home. And calling law enforcement. And when that happens, that's when we're most effective. And we need to try to encourage more and more of that, which is why our NTOC, our public access line, if you will, gets millions of tips a year, and we're frantically trying to push those out when we get them.
I think whatever observation tools you use, whatever algorithms might be in place, that it's kind of disappointing that so often we hear that was there, and we just needed to do a better job of ferreting it out. May I have just another few seconds for a quick question? I was on a school board for 10 years. I could not get in my school as a school board member because we had a security system in place that had to allow you in. And I think we had a resource officer there in Texas at that school. What is the FBI's viewpoint on taking soft targets like a school to where seemingly we rotate into a tragedy too often, to where having that in place, why don't we have more of it? And we had this in place in Indiana in my own school district back 10 to 12 years ago. Why aren't we doing more there?
Well, I think a lot of those are judgments by individual school systems and school boards that may be based on resources, other things. I do know that we on the FBI side have tried to help heighten the awareness of things that they can do to better harden the schools. We've put out PSAs, videos about to better harden the school environment. There's a lot of thinking that has improved in law enforcement and security over the last 10 or 15 years about the best way to protect an otherwise soft target like a school. And so we're really trying to get the word out so that they have the information they need to take some of those actions. And so as to why an individual school may or may not have chosen a particular security measure, that probably depends on the school system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Braun. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Director, very much for coming. The budget request is how much percent over last year?
I don't have the percentage for you right now. I know that we didn't get quite what we had hoped for last year.
Mr. Chairman, what is that number? Do we know? Madam Chairman?
6%.
Okay, what's inflation?
Too high.
More than 6%?
I'm not
I think
sure.
so.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so.
So what I want the American people to know is that the budget request for the FBI is below inflation. Do you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very
The
well.
budget request for the FBI is below inflation.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. After listening to you, and everything you say is legitimate concern, you have a lot to do. Do you think the committee should look at increasing your budget?
Well, first let me say I appreciate the question.
It's not a hard question.
I would say that any additional resources the committee would see fit to send our way, I can absolutely assure you and the rest of the subcommittee they will be put to good use.
Okay, great. I want to ask you to comment on ongoing investigation, but apparently there was an effort, some plot maybe to kill President Bush 43. Have you read about it? Are you familiar with it?
I am familiar with it.
Okay. Let's just make this comment. Is it fair to say that Al-Qaeda and ISIS still exist?
Absolutely.
Is it fair to say there are people thinking every day about how to get into America to kill a bunch of us from those organizations?
Yes.
And the FBI is integral in stopping those plots before they start?
Yes.
Okay. So would you say that after Afghanistan, the threat to the homeland has gone up or down?
Well, let me say this about the threat. We are concerned, very concerned, about what the threat landscape looks like in the wake of the withdrawal of Afghanistan for a number of reasons. One, we're concerned about the loss of sources and collection over there, which means
There are no FBI agents in Afghanistan.
not anymore.
Yeah.
Or at least not that I can.
Yeah, well, I hope they're
Discuss.
not for their sake. Yeah.
So we're concerned about less source coverage over time, and I think Director Burns has testified, just as a matter of fact, that we will lose collection.
Just put a fine point on it, because I don't have much time. Our withdrawal has made us a lot less aware of the threat coming from Afghanistan than before we withdrew. That's a fair statement, right?
I think so, yes.
And it's a fair statement that Al-Qaeda and ISIS still are present in Afghanistan, and maybe their influence is growing.
Certainly present, and I think we are concerned about
Yeah.
them growing, yes.
Okay. So let's look at domestic terrorism. Is there any law that you need that you don't have when it comes to investigating domestic terrorism?
Well, we always welcome more tools in the toolbox, but we, I think, have been very effective with the tools that we do have, not just federal charges, but as I said to Senator Braun, using state charges when appropriate. We've gotten creative in using hate crime charges and things like that as well. What we really need are more resources more than anything
Well,
else.
count me in for more resources to help you deal with this threat as well as other threats. Gun control. Do you know of any system, apparently the fact pattern is, as we understand it now, that the person in Texas who did this horrible thing had no criminal record. How would the system deal with somebody who's never been charged with a crime, never been investigated for a crime, went out and bought a gun? What kind of law would stop that?
Well, we don't know all the facts yet.
Yeah, but let's just
Particular
assume that
instance.
fact pattern.
But there are, depending on the individual, there are other prohibitors in 922
Well,
besides.
here's the point. If
felony.
there's something we can do to deal with this particular situation that we're not doing, can you get back with us?
I'd be happy to work with the committee. I
Okay,
think there's
great.
no one simple, single
Yeah,
answer to
okay,
all of
well,
this.
I'm open-minded to ideas. So finally, from the FBI's point of view, you've been following the Sussman trial, I would assume?
Yes.
Okay, well, he's in trial. But let me just ask you this question. A lot of Americans are concerned with the fact that a campaign lawyer for the Clinton campaign could go to the FBI and provide information to the FBI that led to an investigation of the opposite party, and it seems to not have held much water. Can you understand why people would be concerned about that?
I certainly understand why people are concerned.
And the Horowitz review of the Crossfire Hurricane, you're familiar with his findings, the Inspector General.
Yes.
This is your chance to tell the American people that you're going to make sure that never happens again, and you're dedicated to making sure that, for whatever reason, there are no more Carter Pages investigations that seem to have gotten completely off the rails.
So I will put the Sussman case to the side for the moment because I don't want to
Okay.
comment on a case
Sure.
that's in front of the jury right now. But let me say this. What the conduct that is described in the Inspector General's report, I consider to be utterly unacceptable and also unrepresentative of the FBI that I see every day. And my firm instructions to our people are that we need to make sure that that never happens again. And we have implemented over 40 corrective measures that go directly to the things that are described in that report. We've made changes of the entire leadership team in the FBI. And the FBI that I see today in 2022 is very different from what's described in that report.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. I have another round of questions. I assume you do as well, Senator Moran. I want to talk about something that we discussed a little bit on the phone this week, and that is the whole task force klepto capture and what we might do to address not just Russian officials and oligarchs' circumvention of sanctions and export restrictions, but also what needs to happen to address the ability of transnational crime organizations, corrupt officials in places like Russia, from being able to park their money in our financial system in the United States and the West, and what we need to do to prevent that. And I want to start with the fact that we provided the FBI with over $43 million in supplemental funding for the task force klepto capture as part of the 2022 omnibus. Can you talk a little bit about how you're using that funding and what else we ought to be thinking about as we're looking at how we address the ability of criminals to use our financial system for their own benefit?
Well, first let me say that those who've been profiting from corruption in Russia and treating the world like it's their playground by evading sanctions are people that we are coming after and working closely with partners not just across the federal government, but also with a whole host of foreign partners. And obviously the new klepto capture task force is an integral, really at the heart of that effort. And we've had some success already in freezing bank accounts, luxury yachts, artwork, things like that. Sometimes that's through enabling the FBI provides information to a foreign partner and they're able to take action to seize or freeze, and sometimes it's through us using our own authorities. We're also going after, and this is important, and it goes to something I think that you and I talked about on the phone. It goes to not just the oligarchs, the sanctioned individuals themselves, but to the whole ecosystem or infrastructure that they rely on, the people that they may have on their payroll, the people that otherwise enable them to engage in the corruption and the sanctions evasion. And that's an important part of it. As to the funds, the $43 million that you referred to, for which we're very grateful, we're using that in a variety of ways. We have some of it is, of course, going to our cyber efforts and our counterintelligence efforts related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But we are using it part for our agents and personnel on the klepto capture task force, as well as, and this is an important piece, our pursuit of the cryptocurrency, because that's an important ingredient for a lot of the bad actors here, many of whom think that they can hide behind the anonymization that exists with virtual currency, and they're not as clever as they think they are, but we have to continue to evolve our own technologies and tradecraft to be able to go after them, and we've made some very significant seizures of cryptocurrency lately, working with the Department of Justice, and that's going to be an important, increasingly important part of this going forward.
So what's been the biggest obstacle in trying to address activity, particularly with respect to Russia and the war in Ukraine and those sanctions?
I think I would say that the biggest challenge that we face is a lot of these folks are pretty savvy about relying on opaque other foreign jurisdictions. So there are ways in which, by taking advantage of some of those other systems, they're able to make it more challenging for us to follow the money and get after the money. Not necessarily impossible, and there's a role here for diplomacy, State Department, Treasury Department, others, in engaging with some of those foreign partners to work better with us to help make sure that we've clamped down on the system.
Any particular entities that you would like to name?
I think the State Department would probably appreciate it if I didn't name specific countries in an open hearing, but.
Although you pointed out we are cooperating with the international community, and I have heard from some officials that there are entities that may be part of other countries where countries have cracked down in country, but those entities where they still have significant interests may not have provided the same kind of crackdown. Is that, I mean, I'm being pretty opaque here in the way I'm describing it.
Right, no, opaque is the right word, both for the way we have to talk about it, but also what's in some of these countries. I will say there have been quite a number of countries where we've gotten more cooperation than we might have, in years past. So I don't want to make it sound too bleak. We've had a number of partners that have taken, for them, more aggressive action than we would historically have seen. And that's, I think, a measure of the international community being so appalled by what Russia's up to in the Ukraine.
Thank you. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Let me talk again about the surging increase in violent crime. I believe that two of the most effective ways to address violent crime are through surging FBI resources to the most affected communities through joint federal, local task force, such as Safe Streets task forces. You and I heard the commentary from law enforcement, local and state law enforcement, when we were together in March in Kansas. I understand that as of May, I think it's early May, the FBI surged resources in 6 field offices, and it secured significant arrests and firearm seizures from violent criminals. Director Wray, is the FBI considering additional resource surges over the coming year or expanding its existing task force network?
So on the surges, I think what you're referring to is a new team that I created about 6 months or so ago, which is called our Violent Crime Rapid Deployment Teams. And what that does is we've been sending it to particularly hard-hit hotspots or cities at the embrace or request of both the FBI field office and our local partners to assist. And we've had very good luck in the 6 or so cities where we've done that. I know in Buffalo, for example, several months ago, we had about a 50% decrease in homicides during the surge. In Milwaukee, I think we had a pretty significant decrease. But that's by its very nature somewhat temporary. We can't send those teams to just be there sort of in perpetuity. So part of what we're trying to do is both achieve a short-term dramatic reduction by listening closely to the locals as to what they most need, but then also trying to put in place things that will have a more sustained, durable impact that will outlive the team's deployment. We expect to continue that model, to keep sending that team to different places. But ultimately, as you and I think discussed recently, this is a problem, the violent crime problem, that dominates every discussion I have with chiefs and sheriffs all the time. We had our last nationwide data was a 5% increase in the violent crime rate, which doesn't sound like much to some Americans until you stop and think that means 67,000 people, victims of violent crime that would not have been a victim the year before. And the homicide rate went up 30%, which is I think the highest in like 50 years increase. So any resources the committee, the subcommittee, would be able to send us on the violent crime problem could immediately be put to very effective use, and there'd be a lot of state and local partners who would be very grateful as well, because one of the things we're really trying to do all across the country is lean in to see where we can take cases federally to get some of the worst and to dismantle some of the most significant gangs and keep them off the streets for a much longer period of time.
Director, let me explore just a minute longer the idea of surging, and the point you make, I think, is a good one. Certainly anyone whose life is saved or property is not stolen because of a surge, that's a valuable thing. But what we need is longer-term results from that surge. So is there something that happens structurally? I mean, first of all, I'd say is we're getting more guns out of the hands of people who are not entitled to have guns, I assume, in that surge. And we're putting more criminals who are likely to commit violent crimes to be incarcerated. Those ought to have some longer-lasting effect rather than just the amount of time that your additional resources are in the community.
You're exactly right. There are two key concepts here, partnership and intelligence. Partnership meaning it's got to be a team effort. It's got to be, how do we put the FBI's two together with the state and local law enforcement partners and ATF and DEA and marshals, put one agency's two with another agency's two and have it equal more than four, right? How to get a synergy where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So partnership is key. And then the second piece, intelligence, is when you hear intelligence, really what you should take away from that, what Americans should just take away from that is that's better understanding the problem in order to prioritize going after the thing that's really driving the violent crime in order to have a longer lasting impact. So that might mean identifying particular gangs that are wreaking havoc on a neighborhood. It could mean a particular neighborhood that is disproportionately being fought over by Teen 2 gangs. It could be any number of things, but if you get good intelligence and then the partnership acts based on that intelligence with a strategy, that's how you get an impact that lasts longer.
Works that way. I'd be interested in knowing, Director, if there's any characteristics about the communities that have the most significant increases in violent crime, the most prevalent violent crime. When you focus your efforts on a particular community, what is the common denominator among those communities? And then perhaps we can try to deal with the underlying reason that a community is experiencing that increase.
You know, violent crime is, by its nature, unfortunately, a little bit different everywhere. And that's why we really have to take not a one-size-fits-all. And so what I mean by that is, in one community, it might be a particular neighborhood gang that has just run amok. And if you really drill down, you may find that the homicide rate is being disproportionately driven by that one gang's activity. In another community, there could be a rampage of commercial robberies or carjackings, and that's what's really driving it. In another place, it could be a particular neighborhood or a particular corridor on a highway that's part of a drug trafficking route. In another place, it could be, and this is something we are seeing in a lot of places, too many repeat dangerous offenders who are either out on bail or who have been not serving very long sentences. And the only thing more frustrating to law enforcement than having to arrest somebody who should be behind bars is having to arrest the same person over and over and over again.
That's a good point for that. That's something that can be pursued. That's a concrete path that could be advanced. Let me, I told Senator Shaheen one more question. I meant one more topic. And in September of last year, you testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee that the FBI's failure for its mishandling of the Larry Nassar investigation was, quote, inexcusable. It never should have happened, and we're doing everything in our power to make sure it never happens again. To that end, you testified that the FBI had begun implementing all 4 recommendations from the Inspector General's report. Could you please provide me with an update on where that implementation of those recommendations stand?
I could happy to provide it to you in writing maybe afterwards, if that would be helpful. I mean, for the most part, I think we've implemented all of them quite a while ago, and certainly we took disciplinary action against the one agent who was still with the FBI, you know, once we learned what had happened. And it's hard for me to explain to you how angry and upset I was when I learned what the FBI did and failed to do back in 2015. But I'm determined to make it right now that I'm here, and we're going to make sure that everybody in the FBI learns the lessons from that just tragic experience.
I appreciate that. Senator Blumenthal and I and our subcommittee in the Commerce Committee spent a year and a half exploring, investigating, and providing recommendations for legislation that became law. And we share that frustration, that anger about how everyone who should have done something didn't do it well or didn't do anything. And again, as you, I think, would agree, we would expect the FBI to be among the most purist in their willingness, desire, and capabilities to respond to somebody in need. So it is a terribly sad circumstance, and we await the Department of Justice making some decisions about what to do, if anything, in regard to those individuals.
And just to be clear on that part, you know, we don't, that's really between the Inspector General and the Department of Justice on that.
I wasn't suggesting it. It's a question I asked the Attorney General, but I wanted to highlight it for perhaps, when he reviews your testimony, he will know that he's been questioned once again about this topic. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, thank you very much for raising that issue. And Director Wray, if you do send the response to Senator Moran, I hope, Senator Moran, you'll share it with the members of the committee, because I know there are a lot of people on the committee who are concerned about it. Your final exchange before that issue raised a question for me, because you were talking about the federal crimes that you're investigating. And as we know, the top law enforcement official in our states when it comes to federal crimes are U.S. attorneys. And I have been very troubled by the delay in getting U.S. attorneys in place across this country. And I just wondered if you could speak to what happens if we don't have somebody in that role, if we have somebody who's just acting, or that U.S. attorney has not been officially put in place to take charge of those investigations, and what kind of challenges that presents as you're trying to bring a case before court.
Well, I want to be a little bit careful here. What I would say is the acting U.S. attorneys around the country, in my experience, are some of the most dedicated, most seasoned, most capable prosecutors, federal prosecutors that are out there. And I know a number of them personally and have enormous respect for them. Having said that, it is helpful to a U.S. Attorney's Office and to a law enforcement community to have a Senate-confirmed, presidentially appointed U.S. attorney, because at least in some districts, that's what's required for important initiatives to be pursued, for sometimes, you know, important personnel changes to be made in an office. Having served in a U.S. Attorney's Office and having been Assistant Attorney General dealing with all the U.S. attorneys, you know, in my previous time in government, I know that that there is a level of ability to take action on certain kinds of things that I think is a little bit easier, certainly, for a permanent U.S. attorney. But I also want to be very clear that I think the acting U.S. attorneys that are out there are doing a terrific job, and they're working really well with our field offices.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the importance of reinforcing the job that those acting U.S. attorneys are doing. But I would just argue that at this time, when we're facing a lot of challenges with respect to increased criminal activity, that having the top decision maker in those offices is really critical, and we need to urge the administration to move those people if they haven't been nominated, and members of the Senate to to approve them so that we can get people in place, so that we've got everybody on the ground that we need in order to address the challenges that we're facing when it comes to crime.
May I make this bipartisan, please?
Please do.
I would join the chairman in making the request of the administration, and I suppose the Senate, should they be nominated, to act expeditiously to get us our U.S. attorneys, which are absent in many places, including my home state.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Director Wray. If there are no further questions this afternoon, senators may submit additional questions for the official hearing record. We request the FBI's responses in 30 days, and this subcommittee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. Thank you. Yes, I know that feeling.
See over there.